Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Hello, and welcome back to Podcast of the Caribbean. This is episode 65, and today we are ending season 6 of the podcast by finally diving into something I have wanted to cover ever since the start of this podcast. Today, we are talking about the original Dead Men Tell No Tales script that was written by Terry Rossio. If you are unfamiliar, this script was written way back in 2012, right after the release of On Stranger Tides, and is more of a direct sequel to that film than what we ended up getting in the actual finished film in 2017. In 2018, a year after the release of Dead Men Tell No Tales, Terry Rossio posted on Twitter that he was willing to share his screenplay of the film along with his annotations through email with people. So back then, you could find it through people who had access, and word began to spread throughout the Pirates community. However, in 2023, Terry Rossio released the full screenplay with annotations to his website WordPlayer, and since then the script has been readily accessible for everyone. I knew about this before it was posted on Terry's website publicly, but I had actually not read the script in full back then. I only knew about specific parts that people kept talking about. I'm sure some of you familiar with this script have seen people talk about that piece of concept art of the ghost of James Norrington, and maybe you've heard mentions of a character called the Sea Widow, and the return of Philip Swift and Syrena the Mermaid. Those are all things that come from this script, and while this version of the film is vastly different from the Jeff Nathanson draft that eventually became the actual film, you will notice there are a few similarities in various parts of this that do show up in the final script and the final finished film. So today we are going to go through the script and the annotations, and then I will give my thoughts on the script afterward. So let's dive right into this and see what the original version of Dead Men Tell No Tales would have been. So this screenplay is dated August 15th, 2012, which is just over a year after the release of On Stranger Tides. And as I said earlier, this would have been a more direct sequel to that film, since Philip and Syrena were major players in this version. While both of them return, Angelica does not show up in this script, which is unfortunate, but many of the background pirate characters from On Stranger Tides do show up here as well, as we'll see later on. And even a few returning favorites, but I won't spoil that yet. Obviously, if you've read the script, you know who I'm referring to, but I'll leave it a mystery for now. I should also mention that I am not going to read the entire script word for word, as that would make this episode extremely long, and I'd rather you all go check out the full thing for yourselves. So I'll have the link to Terry's website in the description so you can read the script and the annotations in full. But let's get started here. The story begins in the harbor of Jamaica, where we're introduced to the first new character of the film. This is Cora June, a 10-year-old girl who is wearing an oversized dress that is far too big for her size. Keep that in mind. But she runs to McNally & Sons chart house, and no, this was not named for Kevin McNally, who plays Gibbs. In fact, according to Terry's annotations, it was a reference to the real mapmaker Rand McNally. Once she goes inside, we see Admiral Benbow, another new character, and the leader of the British Navy in this movie. While his name is indeed a reference to the Benbow Inn in Treasure Island, it is also based on the real Navy Admiral John Benbow. Benbow is holding McNally up against the wall, trying to get a point across to him, and McNally then calls for Philip, and we get the reveal of Philip Swift, who is now an apprentice cartographer, and has left his life in the priesthood behind. This new version of Philip in this script is really cool, and honestly, he is one of my favorite parts about the whole thing. But Benbow is here to tell McNally they are not to make charts for the Spanish, and Philip and McNally agree before Benbow leaves. We can obviously see that England and Spain are ready to go to war, and that is a big part of this script. But later we see Philip working on a map, and we see him working on an illustration of Neptune holding his trident, which contains 3 pearls. Keep this in mind for later. But Cora comes up to Philip and wants him to tell her the story of what he is searching for, because there is a specific reason Philip became a cartographer. But Cora then begins to talk about the Mermaid Trove, which is the big treasure being pursued in this film. Philip, of course, is looking for it, and he tells her it's guarded by mermaids and no one has ever seen it and lived to tell the tale. But Cora gives him a ship's logbook that she stole, and later that night, Philip uses that information to finally figure out where the location of the Mermaid Trove is. It is right off the coast of San Domingo, near an old Spanish fort. But suddenly, the whole chart house goes up in flames, and Philip barely escapes with his life. As he looks away, we see Cora in the window still inside, but things are not exactly what they seem. We'll come back to this later, so keep that in mind. But just like in the finished film, the camera pans up to reveal the title of the movie through the flames, Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Men Tell No Tales. We then go underwater somewhere in the Caribbean, and we're looking at a sunken brigantine named the Abyss. There are dead skeletons on this ship, and one of them is clutching onto the helm, which is a reference to the helmsman skeleton from the original Pirates attraction. But suddenly, we see two sea turtles come into frame, and we see none other than Captain Jack Sparrow riding them. He is using these turtles to get to the shipwreck, as it is too deep for him to dive on his own. But this, of course, is referencing the iconic sea turtle story from the first film. But Jack pulls the treasure chest from this wreck and goes back up to the surface, where we see a small little fishing boat named the Cuttlefish. This name is, of course, a reference to Jack's speech to the Brethren Court in At World's End, where he mentions cuttlefish. And this little boat did end up in the final film, but of course the name was changed to the Dying Gull. But we see Jack is not alone, as Scrum is on board the Cuttlefish and is currently his only crewmate. But they then sail to the harbor of St. Vincent, where the two of them believe this chest holds the secret to freeing the Black Pearl, which is still currently in the bottle. And when they open it, they see it is filled to the brim with garter belts. Scrum is very angry and tells Jack they should just sell the pearl to get some kind of money. And obviously, Jack is enraged by this and punches Scrum right in the face, which knocks him out. But afterward, Jack is surprised by a gang of 3 pirates who all have a score to settle with him. Jack takes each one on separately and downs some rum after each guy. After he defeats all 3 of them, Barbossa emerges and tells Jack he also has a score to settle with him, and both of them sword fight here. Jack, who is completely drunk at this point, is defeated, and Barbossa takes the Black Pearl in the bottle from Jack. Jack is incredibly confused, as Barbossa already has the Queen Anne's Revenge, but Barbossa simply states to Jack that he is in love. We then go over to Georgetown, where we see a flyer on a post detailing a pardon for all pirates who surrender to Admiral John Benbow. We then see a bunch of returning characters from the earlier films. We see Salomon, Ezekiel, and the cabin boy from On Stranger Tides, and Cotton and Ho Quan. Ho Quan, if you're unfamiliar, was one of the pirates in Dead Man's Chest, specifically one in the bone cage with Will, Gibbs, Marty, and Cotton. He actually dies in a deleted scene, but is present here in this script. According to the POTC wiki, Terry Rossio actually said that how Ho Quan survived would have been revealed in a potential 6th film. But it's also important to mention here that Cotton does not have his parrot right now, and that will be good to remember for some time later in this script. But Salomon rips the flyer down and brings it into a pub nearby, and we get the reveal of Pintel and Ragetti, who would have both returned for this film. Now, it was actually planned for the both of them to return in this film, even in the later version, as you can actually find concept art of them wearing fancy clothes, like Barbossa and the rest of his crew aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. They were eventually replaced by bringing back Murtaugh and Mulroy, but as to why that happened, I have no idea. But we see all the pirates are robbing this pub, which they deem as their last crime before they get their pardon. Afterward, they all go to the harbor where Admiral John Benbow is giving a speech to the numerous pirates and criminals gathered before him. They can either serve under Benbow in the Navy for a year, or fight in a single battle on behalf of the Navy to have their papers signed and their crimes absolved. We then follow Pintel and Ragetti, who are boarding the HMS Bonaventure, which is the Navy flagship, and they run into Joshua Gibbs. For some reason, Gibbs has also joined the Navy again and is first mate aboard the HMS Bonaventure under Admiral John Benbow. I guess Gibbs also joined for the same reason, to get a pardon, but I don't really understand why he does this. There's no real reason that Terry gives in his annotations for Gibbs' motivations for joining the Navy again, so I'm not really sure. But then we go back over to the harbor of San Domingo, where we're introduced to Queen Inez of Spain. She is the secondary antagonist of this movie. But she arrives in the town and the mayor, along with some townsfolk, come to greet her. But we immediately see what kind of character Queen Inez is, as she orders for everyone to be killed. So the Spanish soldiers kill the mayor and everyone gathered there so they can set up a small home base. We are then introduced to the Marquis, who is actually in love with Queen Inez. He tells her that making port here is risky, but she doesn't care. In fact, the Queen mentions how one of her new handmaidens was rescued at sea, and the Marquis has been quite taken with her. But the Queen then calls for her handmaidens to arrive, and we see the handmaiden in question is none other than Syrena. Obviously, they have no idea she's a mermaid at this point, and they notice she is nervous as she walks down the gangplank. Queen Inez asks if she's afraid of the water, and Syrena simply tells her that she never learned how to swim, which is pretty ironic. But we then go back over to Jack, who is now laying on a beach, and standing over him is Cora, who did somehow survive the burning of the cartography shop earlier. Jack immediately says there's something strange about her, which is an important line to keep in mind. Cora also has a large sword slung across her back, which is another important detail. But Cora is here to enlist Jack's help with something he has some experience with. On her palm, she has the black spot, just like Jack did in Dead Man's Chest. Jack and Scrum immediately turn her down, not wanting to get involved with this. But we see Cora knows a lot for a little 10-year-old girl, and she tells Jack that Barbossa is being helped by someone known as the Sea Widow. This is where we get one of my favorite moments for Jack in this script, as he pins Cora against the rocks and tells her, "I'll have your tongue for speaking that name." Scrum doesn't know what's going on, and Jack tells him they are doomed, and just hearing the Sea Widow's name aloud means she must have wanted it said, and they are already trapped in her web. Cora then tells Jack where Barbossa plans to meet the Sea Widow, and we then go to the three of them on board the Cuttlefish, sailing toward Fort San Cristobal, which is the fort on the map Philip was looking at near the beginning of the script. This fort has been abandoned for 100 years and is slowly crumbling. But Cora then tells Jack what creature is pursuing her for her black spot, given that the Kraken is dead. But apparently, it is actually a sea serpent that is after her, and Jack and Scrum say that nothing can kill a sea serpent. But once they reach the beach near the fort, they notice that Cora has magically disappeared, and they have no idea where she went. But up in the fort, Jack sees Cotton's parrot flying out of a window, which is a very strange sight. But they also see torches illuminating the fort, so the two of them go inside. And once they are inside, they see a whole bunch of skeletons shackled to the walls. But Scrum notices something, so let me read the dialogue here. So Scrum says, "Jack, these are too small." And Jack grimly says, "Aye." And then the narration says, "Scrum is correct. None of the bodies are more than 4 feet high, many less than 2, intensely grotesque and eerie. A bonnet lies next to one diminutive skeleton. Scrum figures it out, his eyes widening. And Scrum says, "Children, Jack, they're all..." And the narration says, "Elsewhere, in a chamber." Scrum is teary-eyed as Jack pushes him along. So yes, all these skeletons are all dead children. Very eerie, and something that really shook me up the first time I read this. And there is a very good reason why they are all children, but we'll get back to that later. But as they press on, Jack notices the dead corpses of the 3 pirates from Barbossa's crew that attacked him earlier. Scrum then cuts off their hands, and as to why, well, we don't know yet. But the two of them make it to the courtyard, where they see Barbossa dancing all by himself. And Jack notices something, and he notices Barbossa's leg has been restored to normal. No more peg leg. Jack and Scrum jump out to surprise Barbossa, who is still dancing, full of glee. And Barbossa even swoops Jack up and starts dancing with him, which is pretty funny. But Barbossa takes Jack into this round room as they're still dancing, and Jack reveals the Sea Widow is known to be able to restore limbs, but it requires payment of some sort. And out of nowhere, Jack's leg is magically shackled to a pillar behind him, and above them, a door opens, and the Sea Widow herself emerges. This is the main villain of this version of the film, and she is a very, very interesting character. Terry describes her as an old woman, her face creased like the bark of a twisted tree, with rotted and missing teeth, and her mouth hanging open when she takes a breath. She also wears a black veil and a mourning gown, like she has just attended a funeral. And probably the creepiest thing about her is her eyes. One of her eyes is white and empty, and the other contains 2 pupils, but when she tilts her head, both of those pupils roll to the empty eye socket. Very, very freaky. But Jack is the payment for Barbossa's deal with the Sea Widow, and Jack the monkey emerges from the shadows as Barbossa leaves. And we see Barbossa is actually scared for Jack with leaving him to the Sea Widow. But now the Widow and Jack are alone, and we get some exposition into her and Jack's characters. And behind the Widow, a bunch of reanimated child skeletons walk toward Jack, which is once again super creepy. But we find out the Sea Widow's husband was lost at sea and it drove her mad. The Widow tells Jack it was his fault, as he set her husband adrift. And when she points at Jack, we see she herself is missing a hand. Her hand was apparently taken by a sea serpent many years ago. Jack asks her what has become of the Black Pearl, and the Widow tells him she released the pearl along with its contents from the bottle. This is why Cotton's parrot had flown out of the fort just a bit ago, and why Jack the monkey also just returned. It is revealed here that Barbossa's leg was also trapped in the bottle, which is how it was restored. But the Black Pearl was sent out onto the sea with the wind and is lost. Jack tries to move away from the Widow, but he falls to the ground, and the Widow then unlocks the shackles holding Jack's leg, and she tells him to run. And Jack is terrified here, but the Widow tells him she found the Mermaid Trove, and she begins to sing a song that Jack is familiar with. We don't get any more info about this song right now, but Jack runs away before the Widow can kill him. Jack runs into Scrum, and they are both being chased by a horde of skeleton children. And as they escape, Jack notices the map to the Mermaid Trove, and he doubles back to get it. But they both eventually reach the edge of the fort, and they jump off into the water before the skeleton children can reach them. We then go over to the Caribbean Sea, where we find Philip in a small fishing boat out at night. He sings My Jolly Sailor Bold here, but out of nowhere, the Monarcha, which is Queen Inez's ship, shows up and they bring Philip on board. They then bring him to San Domingo, where he is first questioned by the Marquis. But Queen Inez then emerges, followed by her handmaidens, and of course, Syrena. Philip of course sees her and his eyes go wide. He's been searching for her this whole time since the last movie. And the Queen notices this and wonders why her and not herself. But Philip then begins to tell the Queen his story, about how he was wounded, but the woman he loved had the ability to heal him. Now this is where we get the explanation of where Syrena took Philip at the end of On Stranger Tides. Philip says the woman he loved was a mermaid, and she took him to the depths of a place that words cannot describe. It was this place that he was healed, but there was a penalty for the mermaid for bringing him to that kingdom, and this penalty, as Syrena says here, was death. But Philip continues and says that the mermaid helped him escape, but the mermaid didn't meet him on the shore as they had agreed. The Queen asks why, and Philip says he does not know. So he spent the next few years searching and studying maps to find her again. The Queen decides to not let Philip live, and he's dragged away by her soldiers. She then tells the Marquis to bring it. As to what this is, we do not know yet, but we soon find out when the Queen and the Marquis go outside, and a group of soldiers bring a chest that contains what the Queen was referring to. Inside the chest is the trident of, not Poseidon, but the trident of Neptune. The full staff of the trident is gone, and it's only the upper portion with the 3 tines, but each tine has a spot where a small round object can fit in. Without the 3 corresponding pearls, the trident is useless, but with them, it is the most powerful weapon on the seas. So now we know what Queen Inez's goal is, which is to find all 3 pearls for the trident. But we then go over to Barbossa, who has arrived in Georgetown on San Domingo. Of course, he is fully back to normal now with 2 normal legs, and he makes his way to a bordello in town. If you're unaware of what that is, it's essentially a brothel. But we see the owner of this brothel is none other than Marty. Marty takes Barbossa into the dance hall of the brothel as the show is about to start. We see Barbossa is interested in one of the ladies of this brothel, and he asks if anyone has touched her. Marty tells him her door is guarded every night and she is still a virgin. But the show begins, and the woman Barbossa is interested in emerges onto the stage. This woman is Nadira, and she is around 20 years old, wearing all sorts of jewelry, and very, very beautiful. As she sings, Marty notices that Barbossa is in love with her, and afterward, Barbossa demands to have her. So we then go to Nadira's chamber, where Barbossa enters in. Nadira and him are alone now, and Barbossa pulls out a bottle of wine and begins to recite some poetry. Yes, Barbossa is so smitten that he is reciting poetry to this woman. He tells her he is determined to win her heart, and is not interested in just having his way with her. We see this is the reason Barbossa decided to get his leg healed, as it was a way to leave his past behind, which was something he needed to do to win Nadira's heart. But he tells her he will do anything to win her love. So Nadira tells him to retrieve a gem hidden in the hilt of the Sword of Triton. If you're unfamiliar, that is the name of Blackbeard's sword that Barbossa, of course, took at the end of On Stranger Tides. So Barbossa smashes the hilt of the sword open to reveal a hidden pearl, which, as Terry reveals in the script here, is named Rises, and commands the winds of the sea. This is one of the 3 pearls of the Trident of Neptune, but once he retrieves this, Nadira agrees to marry him. We then go back to Jack and Scrum, who have made it back to the beach. The map of the Mermaid Trove is all soggy and in pieces now, but Scrum sees the cuttlefish nearby, and out of nowhere, Cora appears again. She is angry at Jack for abandoning her, and she demands him to help her. She pulls out the sword she was carrying on her back and engages Jack in a fight. But the sword Cora has is no ordinary sword, as it has magical properties. It blocks every single one of Jack's attacks and flies back into her hand when Jack disarms her. And the sword even attacks Jack midair without anyone wielding it. Cora then reveals this sword is destined to kill Jack Sparrow, and he will die to it at some point. So let me read what Cora says here. So in the script, Cora says, "You will die by this sword. Ken now to the lie of it. There will be a quarter moon in the sky, the sound of waves crashing. It shall be run through your heart, and your life will be ended. I hold before you Jack Sparrow's bane." And the narration says, "The sword is beautiful, razor sharp, shiny, silver, jeweled guard, leather grip. The blade has a habit of catching the light, making it seem to shimmer. Finely etched runes run the length of the blade." So yes, this sword is Jack Sparrow's bane. Apparently this sword will eventually kill Jack when there is a quarter moon in the sky with waves crashing behind. A very, very interesting concept. But Cora tells Jack the sword cannot kill him as long as Jack wields it. So Jack eventually agrees to Cora's deal, and the sword settles into Jack's hand. Cora then tells Jack the Sea Widow is trying to plunder the Mermaid Trove, and that there is an English fleet heading to the island, but it is doomed. We then go over to that said doomed English fleet, specifically the HMS Bonaventure. We go into the captain's cabin with Admiral Benbow and Gibbs. We see Benbow is determined to kill Queen Inez, and we go outside to where Pintel and Ragetti are in the rat lines. We have a fun moment here between them about the 7 Years' War, and how it will become the 8 Years' War if it keeps going on. Ragetti says they are now wrapped up in something bigger than themselves, and we see there are nearly 100 ships in this armada. Then we go back over to Philip, who is still in a cell on San Domingo, and he is brought out toward a gallows. But he's surprised that the soldiers take him past the gallows toward an expedition of several horses and the Queen's carriage. So Queen Inez, the Marquis, a bunch of soldiers, along with Philip and Syrena, head into the jungle. Syrena drops back a bit on her horse so she can talk to Philip, and here we get Syrena's side of the story, and she says that she had to bargain for his freedom to get him out of the Mermaid Kingdom. For Philip's freedom, she was tasked with returning the Trident of Neptune to the mermaids, who were originally charged with keeping it safe. Philip wonders why she didn't come to him for help, and Syrena does not answer this. But we see the caravan is heading toward Fort San Cristobal in the distance, and once they arrive, the Sea Widow emerges and greets the Queen. But we see here the Widow and Inez have already met, so now we know they are working together. Then we go back over to the Cuttlefish with Jack, Scrum, and Cora. True to his word from earlier, Jack is helping Cora find and kill the sea serpent hunting her. So they load up 2 longboats with supplies, and Scrum stays on the Cuttlefish while Jack and Cora row out in the longboats. But once the 2 of them are far enough away, Jack demands Cora to tell him what she knows about the Sea Widow. So Cora tells him the Widow and Queen Inez have an agreement. The Queen will destroy the British fleet by stealing the seas from beneath them. This will then leave the Mermaid Trove exposed and allow the widow to find what she's looking for, which is something hidden in the trove. But we then quickly go back over to Scrum, who has this funny moment of himself doing a mock trial with himself and an impression of Jack Sparrow. It's pretty funny. But he sees a shadow pass under the water, which of course is the sea serpent approaching. And then the serpent emerges from beneath the waves and heads straight for Jack and Cora. Both of them are still oblivious to it coming, and Jack decides to leave Cora alone to die as he wants to go back to the cuttlefish. And speaking of the cuttlefish, Scrum is screaming trying to get Jack's attention, but he accidentally gets the serpent to change course back toward the cuttlefish with how much sound he's making. But we then go back over to Jack and Cora, and Jack is very suspicious of Cora and how she knows all this information about the Sea Widow and the Mermaid Trove. So Cora reveals that she was the Sea Widow's servant, which is why she knows all this. But the widow caught her eavesdropping and gave her the black spot. But even still, Jack is unconvinced, and he tries to rub off the spot from her hand, thinking it's fake. But he realizes it is not fake, and it's actually a very real black spot. But the sea serpent has changed course again toward Jack and Cora, and this time they do notice it approaching. And as we found out earlier, Jack once again states that nothing can kill a sea serpent. But now we get the fight between the serpent and Jack Sparrow, almost reminiscent of the scene with the ghost sharks in the final film. Jack throws a harpoon at the serpent, and it hits near its eye, and when the serpent dives back underwater, it tugs the boat along behind it. But the rowboat flips over and Jack and Cora go into the water. The serpent then begins to circle around them, and out of nowhere, Jack is sucked under the water, leaving Cora alone with the serpent. And when Jack looks down, he sees a mermaid pulling him down. And there's actually a whole group of mermaids here, 4 in total. And Terry mentions in the script that these are not the fierce fanged mermaids from On Stranger Tides. They are in fact a different tribe, as he calls them. But one of the mermaids, who has a golden tail, actually kisses Jack, which of course gives him the ability to breathe underwater, as we learned in On Stranger Tides. But the serpent emerges and swims after the mermaids and Jack, and they all swim away as fast as possible, pulling Jack with them. But the group then hides in a sunken ship, and the serpent then wraps itself around the wreck and squeezes, which cracks the ship into pieces. One of the mermaids, the golden-tailed one, is injured here, and ends up being swallowed whole by the sea serpent. The rest of the mermaids and Jack swim off, and the serpent ends up distracted by a school of fish that swim right past. This lets Jack and the mermaids fully escape as the serpent loses them and swims off. We then go back to Fort San Cristobal, and we pick up here with Philip in a cell. He is prying a loose brick from the wall, and once he pulls it out, he sees Syrena emerge, dragging the body of a guard she just snapped the neck of. She then unlocks the door and has Philip follow her. Syrena tells him that she knows where the Pearls of Neptune are, and that she needs Philip's help. But they encounter a group of guards, and the two of them do a little act here to distract the guards. Philip acts like Syrena is crazy, and he walks up and grabs one of the swords from the guards and takes them on. They easily defeat them all, and Syrena finds the chest containing the trident. She unlocks it and realizes that none of the pearls are in the trident. But the Queen and the Marquis enter with a bunch of soldiers, and she demands Syrena to tell the truth. So she does, and she reveals the reason why she didn't meet Philip on the shore after she helped him escape. It is because she had actually begun to forget him, as in her mermaid form, the depths of the sea make things from the world above fade away, like love. But the moment she stepped foot on land, everything came back and her feelings were stronger than ever. The Queen decides not to kill Philip and instead turns him back over to the British. But she takes Syrena to the balcony of the fort and literally pushes Syrena over the rail. She of course turns back into a mermaid when she hits the water, and Queen Inez realizes she was telling the truth. But the waves at the bottom of the rock face are too strong, and Syrena ends up clinging to a reef along the shore. And when she looks up, the Sea Widow is standing there, and she says, "There is something I desire, as much as you desire the trident, if you be willing to help." We then go back over to Jack, who is now being held in a mermaid prison. And this prison concept is actually really cool, as it's just in the open water, and the cells are actually a bunch of hammerhead sharks swimming in tight circles around the prisoners. But Jack notices something in the coral of his cell. It is a weathered Bible, and it is indeed Philip's Bible from On Stranger Tides. As we know, Philip was imprisoned here too, so this is a nice little touch to tie everything together. But we then go to an underwater grotto where a mermaid council is taking place. There are 11 thrones around the grotto, but only 8 mermaids are present. Terry notes here that the empty thrones are meant to signify the tribes that have gone extinct. One of the mermaids that is present is from the tribe we saw in On Stranger Tides. But there are also dozens of figureheads from ships around the area too, which is pretty cool. But Jack is brought here and he meets the mermaid empress. She is old, with wrinkled skin, but still very beautiful like the rest of the mermaids. But on her crown, she has one of the 3 pearls of the trident, specifically Miro, the pearl that has the ability to control the creatures of the sea. Now, what is neat is that there is a blue-tailed mermaid here in this council who does not vote. Terry notes that this mermaid is lost in her own world of song. Obviously, when I think of blue-tailed mermaids, I think of Morvrin, Aquila, and Aquala from the Young Jack Sparrow books, and of course this mermaid is not one of those 3, but it would have been really cool to headcanon this mermaid as one of them if this movie had gotten made. But the Empress pulls the pearl from her crown and demonstrates its power to him. Then she gives Jack the pearl, and there's a neat transition here of the pearl dissolving into the moon. And we find ourselves back at the brothel with Barbossa. It is his wedding day, and Marty is all dressed up, but Barbossa is in his usual outfit, albeit nice and clean, and he has a nice new feather in his hat. But a few minutes later, Barbossa and Nadira are both at the altar, and Marty brings the ring, which has the pearl from the Sword of Triton in it. And we see Nadira is wearing white gloves here, and I should also mention she's been wearing gloves the whole script. And when she pulls off the glove to put the ring on, we see she has a wooden hand. Everyone is surprised, even Barbossa, but he still marries her. And after the wedding, Nadira runs back to go get the flowers that she forgot. And when Barbossa goes to follow her, he sees she has disappeared. The flowers are still there, along with a note that Marty picks up and reads. And the note says, "With pain and regret, I leave you, for my heart belongs to another." Barbossa is now immensely hurt and angry, but we go right back over to Jack here. Jack is washed up on a beach, the pearl still in his hand, and we see he washed up on San Domingo. So he goes into the brothel, which is owned by Marty. He tells Marty he needs a crew and a boat for an expedition, and Marty says that he knows someone with a boat. Jack follows him into the dance hall, and he sees Cora there telling the tale of how Jack left her to die with the sea serpent. Scrum is here as well, and he asks Jack if sea serpents can only be found at sea. Jack is of course annoyed at this stupid question, but when he turns around, he sees the sea serpent slithering past the windows of the brothel. Everyone begins to panic, and they throw Jack out into the street. For a moment, he doesn't see the serpent, but then it appears and heads straight for him. So Jack devises a plan. He notices the serpent's tail is all spiky, which gives him a great idea. Once the serpent is distracted, he grabs the tail and shoves it into the serpent's mouth. The sea serpent then bites down on it by accident and instinctually swallows more of its tail. Jack stabs at it repeatedly, and eventually the serpent dies with its tail in its mouth. But Jack and Scrum then head toward the cuttlefish, leaving Cora behind. But Cora actually goes over to the corpse of the sea serpent and cuts into its belly, and she eventually pulls out a human hand. It is curled into a fist like it's holding something, and we see it's a female hand too. Marty is watching this and he's very confused, and he's wondering how Cora knew that hand was even in there. He grabs the hand from her and notices something shining from whatever's being held in the fist. But Cora knocks him out, and then we go back over to the HMS Bonaventure. We see Philip has been rescued by the Navy, and he's brought to Admiral Benbow by Gibbs, Pintel, and Righetti. Philip tells him that Queen Inez is at Fort San Cristobal, away from the rest of her fleet. So they adjust course and head to the fort, and we then head back over to the Cuttlefish with Jack and Scrum. Jack is now looking for the British Armada, and Scrum asks Jack why he's so enraptured by the Mermaid Trove. And this is where we get a big reveal from Jack, so I'll read the dialogue here for you all. Jack regards Scrum, thoughtful, sits with his back to the mast. We've never heard Jack tell a story before, and never seen him this genuine. And Jack says, "The rocks ahead were covered. Mermaids. 48 days at sea, there was no choice. We had to sail through. I ordered the crew to use cold tar to plug their ears, but I was curious. I wanted to hear. My crew lashed me to the mast, and I told them, leave me there, no matter what I said. We passed by, close, and I heard it. Singing. Haunting. Beautiful, beyond anything the mind can imagine. I struggled, pleaded, let me go, cursed my scurvy crew to the darkest pit of hell. No need. The tar didn't work. One by one they leapt into those frozen waters, and swam to their doom. And the narration says Jack has to pause. He does not take the loss of any crew member lightly. He gathers himself. And Jack continues and says, the ship sailed on, the song fading, tearing swaths of my soul away with it. 3 days before I could free myself of my bonds. I could never free myself of that song. And the narration says Jack falls silent. Scrum finishes the tale. And Scrum says, and ever since, Jack Sparrow sailed the seas, chasing that horizon, chasing that song. Scrum deduces the source of this song is located in the Mermaid Trove, but they are interrupted by the HMS Bonaventure and the rest of the fleet sailing right past them. But we quickly go back to the Marquis and Queen Inez, who are watching from the fort at the fleet advancing toward them. Neither of them know where the Sea Widow is, and back aboard the HMS Bonaventure, Admiral Benbow gives the order to fire at will. The Spanish soldiers fire back at the ships from the fort, and while this battle begins, Jack and Scrum sneak onto the HMS Bonaventure and reunite with all the pirates. So now Jack, Scrum, Pintel, Rigetti, Salomon, Ezekiel, the cabin boy, Gibbs, and Philip are all huddled together. Jack and Scrum tell them of the Mermaid Trove and the untold riches kept there, and all the pirates are immediately on board with this plan. Everyone then follows Jack and Scrum, except for Gibbs. Jack asks Gibbs to come with them, but Gibbs tells him he has a duty to his ship that he cannot leave it in a time of battle. So Jack says to warn the Admiral and get the ships to retreat. Gibbs agrees to this, and before Jack leaves, he smiles and says he's a lucky captain that has Josh McGibbs as first mate. We'll talk more about Gibbs after we get through the script, as I have some thoughts about this. But we see Cora is at Fort San Cristobal now, and she demands to speak with Queen Inez. She eventually finds the Queen and the Marquis, and they bring over the chest containing the trident. We see Cora still has that hand she recovered from the sea serpent, and she orders the soldiers to bring her water, as she will be thirsty. But we then go back to Gibbs, who tells Admiral Benbow to retreat, as he knows this is a trap for all of them. Benbow trusts Gibbs despite his pirate past, and orders for the fleet to retreat. But then we go back to the fort, where we see Cora lifting up one of her hands from her oversized dress. And we find out here that Cora is also missing a hand, just like Nadira, just like the Sea Widow. And as Cora drinks water, she grows older and suddenly looks just like Nadira, but she keeps drinking and then she morphs into the Sea Widow herself. So yes, there have been hints the whole time, but the Sea Widow, Cora, and Nadira are all the same person, just at different ages. And the Widow has the power to change her age from her magical abilities. And the hand that was recovered from the sea serpent is actually the Widow's lost hand, or Cora's lost hand, or Nadira's lost hand. They are all the same, but when the Widow reattaches her hand, she opens it to reveal the third pearl of Neptune, which is Tyra, which has the power to control the tides. And since they are all the same person, the Widow also has Rices, aka the pearl from the Sword of Triton that was put on her wedding ring by Barbossa. That pearl has the power to control the winds. The third pearl, of course, is still in the possession of Jack Sparrow, but they only need these two for what they are about to do. The pearls are placed into the trident, and Queen Inez wields it as she steps onto the balcony and begins to use its power. The seas begin to swirl and the wind picks up, and we go back over to the HMS Bonaventure now. One of the shots fired from the fort hits Admiral Benbow in the chest, and he goes down. He isn't dead, but with him incapacitated, Gibbs assumes the title of captain. The water is now rising into steep walls around the fleet, and Captain Gibbs orders the Bonaventure to sail toward the center, hoping to crest it. Then we go over to the Cuttlefish, where all the pirates are watching what is happening to the sea. There's this really cool moment where Rigetti asks if anyone can hear trumpets, as there are supposed to be trumpets at the end of the world. Then we go over to the brothel, where Barbossa is sulking, but Marty comes in and warns him of what is happening. The water of the ocean is literally receding from the shore, and boats and ships are falling down onto what was the bottom of the sea, which is now just exposed sand. Barbossa knows this is the Sea Widow's doing, and he then realizes something. He asks Marty if anyone has seen Nadira besides him, and Marty said that sometimes they saw an old woman entering her room, and the woman would sometimes leave without arriving, and arrive sometimes without even leaving. This makes Barbossa realize he was played, as he makes the connection that Nadira was the Sea Widow the whole time. And then we get this line from him. "Never has there been a bigger fool in the world than Captain Hector Barbossa." But Barbossa notices rats running away from the shore, and he knows what's about to come. He yells for everyone to get to higher ground, as he tells Marty when the seas recede, they come back with a vengeance. Back on the cuttlefish, it drops as the water level drops, and ends up stuck on a coral tree, high above the ocean floor. Everyone then climbs down the coral to the bottom of the ocean, and if you haven't made the connection, this is the early version of Poseidon's tomb from the finished film. Jack sees some of the British ships falling down to the seafloor with their crews screaming as the ships fall. But Philip then urges everyone to follow him, and they all make their way toward the Mermaid Trove. But we then get something that actually was in the finished film, or more specifically in a deleted scene. Through the wall of water, the crew sees a massive blue whale swim by. If you've seen the deleted scenes for Pirates 5, you will know this was actually filmed with Jack and Karina watching a whale swim past while they're in Poseidon's tomb. Pretty cool, this exact moment remained all the way through the various scripts, although it was unfortunately cut from the film in the end. But the whole group eventually reaches a large statue of Neptune carved into the rock, and an entrance to the Mermaid Kingdom. As they approach, they see someone emerging from the entrance, and it's none other than Syrena. Philip and Syrena hug, and she leads them inside. Then we go back to the fort, where Queen Inez and the Marquis are looking at all the British ships lying on the seafloor. Everyone bows before the Queen, as she has tamed the seas to her will. Then we go over to the ocean floor and pick up with Gibbs, who is pulling Admiral Benbow through the sand. And out of nowhere, we see that Tai Huang was apparently on the crew of the HMS Bonaventure, as he just appears out of nowhere in this scene. He is not mentioned at all until this very specific moment, so I have no idea why he's even here. He should be in Singapore and not on a British Navy ship serving England. So I have no idea, but Gibbs has an idea to get them all to safety, and it's a very old trick we've seen before. They get Benbow into a longboat and push him toward the wall of water. But before we see what happens, we go back over to Jack and the rest of the crew. Jack stops as he hears something, and Syrena notes that he's heard it before. This, of course, is the siren song, which is the thing that Jack has come here to find, and something he's been searching for almost all of his life. But the group then emerges into the Mermaid Trove itself, which is a gigantic cavern full of treasure. We are talking mountains of treasure, from gold, jewels, and everything in between. But the trove is also a tomb, as there are various Mermaid Queen corpses lying on each hill of treasure. Jack realizes the treasure is to honor each dead queen, and there are even bones from dead sea serpents, as since they cannot be killed, they go here to die. But the pirates go for the treasure, of course, while Jack looks for the source of the siren song. Syrena and Philip follow Jack, and Jack eventually reaches the tomb of the first Mermaid Queen, and in her grasp she holds the siren shell. This is the source of the legendary siren song, which has been calling to Jack ever since he heard it years ago. The song emanates from the shell, and Syrena says that each queen is laid to rest with the song she sang in life. And Philip adds here that some believe the song offers a path back, should the queen need to return. Some interesting mermaid lore. But Jack puts a scarf into the shell to quiet the song, and he pulls it out of the queen's grasp. Then we go back over to the fort, where the Sea Widow finally turns on Queen Inez and the Marquis. Her army of skeleton children swarm the Marquis, and they bring him to the edge of the balcony. He hangs there, and even though the queen gives the trident to the Sea Widow, the Marquis falls to his death. If you remember from earlier, the two of them were in love, and Queen Inez screams as she backs away from the widow, disappearing into the darkness of the fort. We then go back over to Jack in the Mermaid Trove, where Scrum is telling Jack to smash the siren shell, but Jack cannot find it in himself to do so. This hesitation only gives Syrena more time to take the shell from Jack as she runs toward the wall of water at the other side of the trove. Philip stands between Jack and Syrena, and Jack pushes Philip out of the way, running after Syrena. Jack is enraged right now, but he is too slow, and Syrena jumps into the wall of water, transforming into a mermaid and swimming away. Jack screams in anger, and this is a really cool moment. Seeing Jack truly angry is something we have not seen much, and this script has a lot of really cool moments where Jack drops his facade and we see the real man behind the Jack Sparrow act, and that's really, really cool. One of my favorite things of this whole entire script. But we go back to Gibbs and the Bonaventure crew as they get the boat to the wall of water. Gibbs ties Benbow to the seats of the boat and orders the crew to flip it over. Everyone then huddles underneath the overturned boat now, and they all run toward the water. And you can probably guess what they're doing. This is a very cool callback to Jack and Will in the boat under the water in The Curse of the Black Pearl. Once they break through the water wall, the boat begins to rise, and soon after, the boat breaks the surface, and the crew flips it over and sails away from the edge. We then meet back up with Syrena, who climbs onto the rocks at the bottom of the sea, with the fort up above. We find out here that Syrena had made a deal with the Sea Widow earlier to retrieve the shell for her. Then the skeleton children swarm her and take the siren shell as the Sea Widow looks down at them from up in the fort. She twists the trident and the walls of water begin to move, slowly beginning to fall. Jack and the crew run back to the cuttlefish, which is still up in that coral tree, and then we go back over to San Domingo, where Barbossa runs up a hill and sees the water rushing back toward the island. It is a tsunami, and slams into the shore and begins to rip everything up as the water rushes over the land. Marty is still in town checking for people who haven't evacuated yet, but when he notices the water coming, he climbs up a flagpole to save himself. Jack and the crew leave the treasure behind as they climb up the coral tree back to the cuttlefish, and once the water reaches it, the ship flies free and Jack is sent overboard into the water. Barbossa watches as the remaining Navy Marines at the bottom of the sea are killed by the water, screams echoing throughout the area. But what happened to Jack? Well, he opens his eyes and finds himself still in the water, although it's now completely dark all around him. There is a mist covering the still water, and there is absolutely nothing in any direction. The water is completely still and serene, and completely quiet. So he begins to swim in a random direction, hoping to the gods that he can get out of this. But over time, Jack begins to hallucinate, and Barbossa appears alongside him, saying one of his iconic lines from The Curse of the Black Pearl. And Barbossa says, "You're off the edge of the map, mate. Here there be monsters." Then, Barbossa transforms into a skeleton as the moonlight hits him, and he sinks down under the water and disappears. Jack continues swimming and comes into contact with a large British flag in the water. He gets caught up in it, and as he struggles to free himself, he comes face to face with the bloated corpse of Cutler Beckett, who says, "Currency is the currency of the realm," which of course is the line he says to Elizabeth in Dead Man's Chest. Crabs then emerge from Beckett's corpse, and Jack pushes him away and swims off. As he continues to swim, he sees a longboat in the distance, and sitting in this longboat is none other than James Norrington. Yes, the ghost of James Norrington, the source of that piece of concept art I'm sure we're all familiar with. Norrington yells out to Jack and says, "Jack, over here!" A short drop and a sudden stop. Then Norrington holds out a pistol, and Terry notes this pistol is the exact same one he points at Jack before the tavern brawl in Dead Man's Chest, and Norrington's ghost fires it, which shoots the boat backward, disappearing into the fog. Jack continues to swim, and he sees Queen Inez's throne floating in the water, and as the throne turns around, we see Edward Teague sitting in the throne playing his guitar. Teague says, "My advice to you, Jackie, don't die." And the narration says, Jack is listless, unmoving in the water. And Jack says, "Don't die." And Teague says, "Don't be lost at sea, or the hag will have your bones." The narration says Jack struggles a little, and Teague continues and says, "Good, good, Jackie. This be not your fate to die here. Keep going." The narration says Jack musters his energy, continues swimming, and Teague says, "You can live forever, Jackie. You and me both. We will sail beyond the sunset. You and me, together." Teague then disappears, and Jack sees Scrum sitting in a longboat with 2 goats. He is playing a trumpet, and a crossbow also sits in the boat as well. This, of course, is referencing what Jack says to Gibbs at the end of On Stranger Tides on how to get the Black Pearl out of the bottle. But Scrum says, "And so Jack swam on. Some say that his will be so strong, Neptune himself took note, and be moved to pity, and so granted a boon, unforeseen, to one Captain Jack Sparrow." Scrum then disappears, but through the fog, the Black Pearl emerges and sails directly toward Jack. A rope is thrown out to him, and he climbs on board. But he realizes there is no one aboard the ship, and when he goes up to the helm, the wheel jerks out of his hands, and the rigging begins to come to life, just like what had happened when Blackbeard attacked. The ropes pull Jack to the prow of the Pearl and tie him there, and the fog finally lifts, which shows Jack the Pearl is heading right toward Fort San Cristobal. And as the audience, we realize the Sea Widow is controlling the Pearl here. We then see the Widow pull out the scarf from the siren shell, and the song begins to sound as she holds it to her ear as she's listening to it. Then she smashes it on the ground, sniffing the remains to pick up the last of the song before it dissipates. Jack is able to free himself as the Pearl gets stuck in the rocks, and he hears singing from above. He looks up and sees a female figure standing up in the fort with her arms outstretched, singing the siren song. Jack climbs up to the crow's nest, and a rope suddenly springs up and supports Jack as he walks on air from the mast to the fort. He gets to the fort, and Jack makes his way toward the source of the song, cutting down Spanish soldiers who stand in his way. And he eventually makes it there and finds Nadira, the source of the singing. So let me read this page for you. So the narration says, "The lovely Nadira, the figure on the balcony, singing, backed by the rising moon. She turns, and Nadira says, 'Finally, you came. I never thought I would see you again.' The narration says, Jack drifts forward as if in a dream. And Nadira continues and says, 'I waited for you. Lost at sea, they said, but I didn't believe them. And here you are. Come to me.' The narration says, Jack steps forward. He cannot resist, and she melts into his arms. They kiss. They kiss long and hard. The embrace tightens, and as the kiss continues, Nadira transforms. Her height shrinks. Her skin sags. Her hair turns white. Nadira is the Sea Widow. Jack breaks this unholy kiss, backs away, and stares at this hideous sight before him. Her crazy eyes, wrinkled face, white hair, missing teeth, the rotting skin. The Sea Widow smiles prettily, happy and flushed as any maiden. And the Sea Widow says, 'Oh, Jack, don't worry. I know you are not my beloved. I am not that far gone. But you will die like him, yes.' Jack then tells her 'as you wish,' which Terry notes is a reference to the Princess Bride. And the Sea Widow knows he's been enraptured by the song. So Jack moves in and kisses the Widow again, and they begin to dance a waltz. The Widow transforms back into Nadira, and we get some important information here. So I'm going to read part of the script again. So Nadira says, 'My poor beloved, his ship, burned by pirates.' The narration says, 'Another spin, back to the Sea Widow. Another spin, and most distressing of all, Jack is dancing with little Cora.' And Cora says, 'And he was set adrift in a longboat, no food or water.' The narration says, she smiles, 'Another spin, back to the Sea Widow.' And the Widow says, 'With our children, and they starved first. Do you understand, Jack? They starved first. He couldn't resist.' And the narration says, she buries her face in his shoulder. Jack moves in close, faces her away, holds her from behind. They sway as she transforms again. And Nadira says, 'And then he took his life, as will you.' The Widow asks if Jack brought the sword destined to kill him, and he says yes. But we see Barbossa emerge into the room, angered as he sees Jack dancing with Nadira. So both him and Jack begin to duel, and when they both parry each other, they both lose their swords at the same time. And when they grab their weapons, Barbossa grabs the sword Jack was using, which of course is the sword destined to kill Jack. Barbossa, of course, has no idea, but they continue to fight, but Jack is able to disarm Barbossa and they both lose their swords again. Barbossa grabs his own sword, and Jack then begins to talk to someone, although Barbossa has no idea who. He tells Barbossa he's talking to the sword, telling it that Barbossa is about to kill him, and the sword won't get the pleasure of fulfilling its destiny. So the sword then clatters to the floor in front of Jack, and he begins to fight Barbossa again. Jack is able to knock Barbossa out, and he heads to the rooftop of the tower where the Sea Widow is standing. She is holding the trident and surrounded by the skeleton children, singing the siren song. But here we get the final reveal of the truth behind the Sea Widow. So let me read this page. So the Sea Widow says, "Now, Jack, the sword, you will take your life." Jack says, "And be silenced forever." And the narration says, Jack unsheathes his sword. And the Sea Widow says, "What?" And Jack says, "That is what you wish, is it not? To silence me, forever. The dead tell no tales, they say." And the Sea Widow says, "You have no tale to tell." And Jack says, "All fair and above board, I alone know the truth, for it was I that found you, adrift, alone. See? You have the power to silence me, and you do not. Part of you knows." And the narration says, Jack steps toward her, into the swaying grass of the skeleton children, truly macabre. And Jack continues and says, "There was never a husband. You were never a widow. It was you in the longboat. It was you who consumed your own children." And the Sea Widow says, "No, that's not how it happened. I am the Sea Widow." And the narration says, Jack nods. And Jack says, "Have it your way." "Oh." And the narration says, Jack pulls an item from his pocket, glowing, unfolds his fingers. In his palm, Miro, the pearl given to him by the Mermaid Empress. And Jack says, "Before I set your husband adrift, he gave me this." And the Sea Widow says, "What? He did?" And Jack says, "Aye, to give to you." The narration says, Jack holds it forth. And Jack says, "He did. Take it." And the narration says, the Sea Widow approaches, gazes at the pearl. And the Sea Widow says, "For me." And the narration says, she takes it, adds it to the trident. Because the third tine is broken, this pearl simply floats in the air, parallel to the others, where it would hang if the tine were present. And the Sea Widow says, "Miro, which commands the creatures of the sea." And Jack says, "And now, all the creatures of the sea can find you." And the narration says, the Sea Widow nods. Then the pupils in her eyes swing over to Jack as she realizes her error. So the Sea Widow then transforms to Cora, then Nadira, and we see 3 sea serpents wrapping themselves around the tower, making their way upward. The Widow tries to command them to stop, but it's no use. The serpents are no longer in the sea, which means that Miro has no command over them. The Widow drops the trident and it falls into the water below. Philip and a bunch of the pirates are down on the rocks and they see it fall. The serpents make their way to the top next to where the Sea Widow is standing, and we get one final exchange between her and Jack. So Jack says, "Widow!" And the narration says, the Sea Widow looks to Jack. Their eyes connect. And Jack says, "You go to join them, the children you so loved." And the narration says, the Sea Widow relaxes, and for the first time, each of her pupils is in a separate eye, and she looks like a normal old lady, sad, but at peace. She smiles as one of the sea serpents strikes and devours her. It lifts its head, waggling back and forth. The tower then crumbles from all the weight, and Jack runs down to escape. As the fort crumbles, we see Queen Inez, who is still alive and escaping with her throne dragging behind her, but she is stopped by Gibbs, Admiral Benbow, who has been bandaged, and other Navy Marines who arrest her. But the next morning we have our final interaction between Philip and Syrena on the shore of San Domingo. Philip retrieved the trident after the Widow dropped it and presents it to her now. He wonders why she isn't as happy as she should be now that she has the trident back. Syrena asks him if he gave her this to send her away, since that was her entire goal, to be welcomed back into her kingdom. But Philip says she will return it and be forgiven by her people, and he will love her for doing what is right. But as we know from earlier, once Syrena goes back down there, she will forget everything about the world above, including Philip. But the two of them kiss here, and Philip tells her, "You will remember." Syrena backs away into the water and transforms, before she dives down and swims away. And as she disappears, we dissolve to some time later, where Philip has now taken up residence in a lighthouse as he searches and waits for Syrena to hopefully return to him. But that is the end of Philip and Syrena's story in this film. A very bittersweet ending for the two of them, just like Will and Elizabeth in At World's End. And we see the lighthouse concept stayed through to the final film, as instead of Philip looking for Syrena, it ended up being the Turner family house, where Elizabeth keeps a lookout for Will. But we go to the final scene aboard the Black Pearl, where we see Jack offers Barbossa the position of first mate, just like old times. Barbossa accepts as Jack the monkey swings onto his shoulder, and Barbossa asks what Jack plans to do now that he is free of the siren song. Jack tells the crew that it's still out there, just farther out. And his final line in this film is this: "Mates, we live forever if we live a day. Today, we sail beyond the sunset." Then the Black Pearl sails off into the sunset just like it does at the end of the final film. And that is the end of the original version of Dead Men Tell No Tales. But just like every Pirates movie, there is also an end credit scene. We see a match light in a dark room on board the Black Pearl, and we see Barbossa with a bunch of pirates huddled around him. So let me read this last bit. So Barbossa says, "The topic is mutiny, gentlemen. Mutiny most foul. And this time, we take his life as well." And the narration says, "Murmurs of agreement from assembled crew members, shadowy figures. We don't know exactly who is there. A dragging sound. Jack the monkey returns into the light of the candle, pulling something behind him. Jack Sparrow's sword, destined to kill him. Barbossa lifts the sword, regards it. Barbossa's eyes glitter in the flames. He turns his head, now staring nearly straight into the camera. And Barbossa says, 'So, who be with me?'" And that is the end of Terry Rossio's original script for Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Men Tell No Tales. As we see in this end credit scene, it brings everything back around with Barbossa planning another mutiny against Jack Sparrow, but this time with the sword that is destined to kill him. A very enticing tease for the next movie. But yeah, that brings us to the end of the script. So let me go over my thoughts about this. Overall, I do really like this script. The story is really cool, the new characters are really interesting, and I especially love the Sea Widow. There are practically no female Pirates of the Caribbean villains, and the few we have are only found in the books, like Madame Minuit, Barbara Huntington, and you can even throw Morvrin, Aquila, and Aquala in there too if you want. This would have been the first Pirates movie with a female villain, and even a secondary female villain too with Queen Inez, and that would have been super, super cool. The Sea Widow's character, though, is insanely creepy, and the whole skeleton children thing is freaky too. I can only imagine how that would have all looked on screen. And the story behind the Sea Widow, aka the truth only Jack and her knew about, was that she ate her children to survive. That explains why she has all these skeleton children. Overall, she is a very, very interesting character, and someone I would have loved to see in a Pirates movie. Of course, over time, the character of the Sea Widow was eventually changed into Shanza in the final movie, but there isn't much connective tissue between both characters. But I really like Jack Sparrow throughout this script, as he is very serious for most of it, and we get really good looks into his past, and especially his psyche. The reveal of his lust for finding the siren song being what has driven him on throughout the franchise is really interesting, as I don't really like big character defining traits thrown into a franchise like already a few movies in. I'm not sure how I feel about that, and the whole reason he wanted to sail beyond the horizon was just to find the song. I don't know, it's a little weird. I don't know how I feel about it. However, I do really love how Philip Swift and Syrena were major parts of this script. I personally love their characters in On Stranger Tides. I'm in the minority, I know, but this would have been a great way to have them grow and give them that bittersweet ending at the end that sort of parallels Will and Elizabeth in At World's End. And I also really love the scale of this movie. Obviously, some of the third act was kept, like the ocean opening up and closing in, but it feels so grand in this script, especially with the tsunami and that whole scene. It just feels so epic in scale. The Mermaid Trove as the central treasure in this is really cool, and we get a really good look into the mermaid culture in this script too, which is really nice. And who could forget that Pintail and Ragetti return in this script, along with a bunch of other pirates from the other films? That would have been awesome to have them back. And I like the concept of a sword being destined to kill Jack, and I think Terry executed that idea pretty well here. Oh, and the sea serpent is just so cool. I've always wanted a sea serpent in Pirates of the Caribbean, especially after seeing the climax of the Chronicles of Narnia Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where a sea serpent attacks a ship, if you haven't seen the movie. That scene always screamed Pirates of the Caribbean to me, and it would have been super cool to get a creature like that in the films. Also, the whole dream sequence with Jack is absolutely fantastic. I love every single aspect of that. How he encounters Barbossa, he encounters Beckett's dead corpse, and Norrington's ghost. It's just super, super cool. Of course, he even sees Teague and Scrum as well. That whole scene is just incredible. I love everything about it. Although the whole aspect of him encountering the ghost of James Norrington is very exaggerated. Like, because we have that piece of concept art, a lot of people who haven't read the script act like it's a much bigger deal, but really he just has that one line and then vanishes, which is kind of funny. But it's still such a great scene, and probably would have been one of my favorite Pirates of the Caribbean scenes of all time if this movie had gotten made. Now, onto what I'm not the biggest fan of. Barbossa's story in this movie is just a little strange. Of course, the whole Barbossa love plot ended up turning into Margaret Smith and their daughter Karina, but I'm not sure how I feel about Barbossa lusting after a 20-year-old girl. Obviously, Nadira is the Sea Widow, and that ties everything together, and yes, I know these characters are pirates and they aren't very good people all the time, but I don't know, it just rubs me the wrong way. Let me know if you feel the same. Also, the other thing I don't like is how Terry handles Gibbs in this script. Gibbs apparently went back into the Navy full-time after On Stranger Tides, and is almost a reformed man at this point. In the finished movie, we have that scene where Gibbs and the crew leave Jack, and I've always said that Gibbs would never do that. He would never leave Jack behind, but that is kind of tame to his character in this script. I don't think Gibbs would have ever gone back into the Navy like he did here. And even him staying behind on the Navy ship when Jack asks him to come with him and the rest of the pirates, I don't know, it just kind of goes against his whole character in my opinion. I don't think Gibbs would ever go back to the Navy. I think he would just remain a pirate for the rest of his life until he retires, you know? And I also don't like how reduced his role in this movie is. He definitely has the least amount of screen time in this movie compared to his role in the other films. Of course, you could also argue that his role in the final Dead Men Tell No Tales is also a bit smaller, but I don't know, I like him in that movie more than this script. But aside from Barbossa and Gibbs, I really like pretty much everything else about this script. But now it's time for the million-dollar question. Would I have preferred this script over what we got in the finished film? And I know many of you out there are probably saying, yes, of course I would have. But honestly, I have mixed feelings. It's a double-edged sword for me. On one hand, you get all these incredible things in this script, and the return of other characters like Philip and Syrena and a lot of the background pirate characters. But then, of course, you don't get the resolution to Will and Elizabeth's story, you don't get Henry or Karina, and you don't get Salazar. There are positives and negatives to both this script and the finished movie, and I don't really know what I would prefer. Obviously, as the Will Turner fan that I am very partial to the finished movie as we have the whole Turner plotline there, and I love that movie because of that. I also really love Karina too, and I love how she is Barbossa's daughter. But on the other hand, I really love Philip and Syrena. I think they're very underrated in my opinion, and I would have really loved to see them again. And the Sea Widow is an amazing villain, and I think I definitely do prefer her over Salazar. But it really is up to personal preference on what you like more. I know there are glaring plot holes in the finished film, and there are no real plot holes to be found in this script, so that's a plus. But I'm still very torn. If we had gotten this as Pirates 5 and Pirates 6 brought in Henry and Karina and the whole resolution to Will and Elizabeth's story, that would have been awesome, and honestly a great way to tie the franchise together at the end with Will and Elizabeth's reunion. But I am still a defender of the final version of Dead Men Tell No Tales, and despite its issues, I have to side with that version. That doesn't mean I don't love this script. I do, I really do. But I think it's also more so the film has existed for almost 9 years now, and I have that connection with it. But you have to kind of keep in mind that nothing in the finished movie existed when this script was being written. So you have to think about it like that movie never existed at all. But let me know your thoughts on if you would have preferred this over the finished Dead Men Tell No Tales film. I would love to hear what you think. But anyway, that brings us to the end of this episode. A fantastic way to close out season 6 of the podcast. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. It's been a very long time coming to cover this, so I'm very, very happy I finally got the chance to. And if you haven't read the script in full for yourself, I highly recommend checking it out. And make sure you read the annotations too, as they give some great insight into extra details that Terry explains. Now, with this being the end of season 6, that means we are going on break for a bit, but I have some special surprises in store. Coming up soon, I have a very special bonus episode featuring the very first guest to join me on Podcast of the Caribbean. If you follow the podcast on social media, you will have already seen this news, but for those unaware, I had the incredible opportunity to talk with David Vengus, who was the first assistant director on Pirates of the Caribbean Dead Man's Chest and At World's End. It was so much fun, and I cannot wait for you all to hear it. So stay tuned for that interview going live pretty soon. But for now, thank you so much for rating, reviewing, and simply just listening to the podcast. It's always so much fun to talk about Pirates of the Caribbean like this, and to know that people out there really do enjoy listening. So thank you once again for that. And once again, if you missed it, this year is the 20th anniversary of Dead Man's Chest, and I will be doing a special episode for that, just like I did for The Curse of Black Pearl back in 2023. But if you want to get into the anniversary spirit, I have launched some really cool 20th anniversary Dead Man's Chest merchandise on my merch store, so please go check that out if you're interested. But thank you once again, and stay tuned for the bonus episode featuring David Vengus coming real soon. You are not going to want to miss that. But for now, I'll see you next time. Take care. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, you can send over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Instagram and Threads at Podcast of the Caribbean, and over on Twitter/X and Bluesky at PodcastPOTC. I post fun content and trivia, so make sure to check those platforms out. You can also buy merchandise for the podcast over on TeePublic and Dashery. Be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon, and always remember, dead men tell no tales.